Here's the opening of a fresh version. It follows the same theme of deep recognition and internal transformation, but with new wording, new progression, and different metaphors, rather than repeating the original. There are moments in life that don't announce themselves. They don't arrive with noise. They don't ask for your attention. They don't come carrying signs that tell you everything is about to become different. They simply appear quietly, almost invisibly, and by the time you realize something has changed, it already has. I've been thinking about that a lot lately, not because I enjoy looking backward, but because I can't find the exact point where everything stopped feeling familiar. I keep searching for the beginning, the first conversation, the first silence, the first moment where something inside me paused for reasons I couldn't explain. But every time I think I've found it, I realize it wasn't the beginning at all. It was only the first moment I noticed what had already been growing underneath. That's the strange thing about certain people. They don't enter your life the way everyone else does. Most people arrive loudly. They introduce themselves through stories, opinions, expectations, personalities they hope you'll accept. Everything is visible. Everything is immediate. Everything asks to be noticed. You never seemed interested in proving, never did that. You never seemed interested in proving anything. You never tried to become unforgettable. Ironically, that's exactly why you became impossible to forget. At first I thought what existed between us was simply an unusual level of understanding, rare, perhaps unexpected, but still explainable. I convinced myself that if I paid enough attention, I'd eventually reduce it into something ordinary, a coincidence, compatible personalities, similar ways of thinking, shared perspectives, something logical, something predictable, something that could fit inside a definition. Instead, every explanation I found felt smaller than what I was trying to describe. Nothing fully accounted for it, not because it was dramatic, because it was accurate. Accuracy has a different weight. Emotion can exaggerate, merit can distort, hope can invent, but accuracy simply exists. It remains true whether anyone recognizes, doesn't ask to be believed. It remains true whether anyone recognizes it or not. That's what this became for me. Not an emotional mystery, an undeniable observation. The more distance I tried creating, the clearer everything became. Which made no sense. Distant is supposed to blur people. It's supposed to make presence fade until memory replaces, supposed to soften details. It's supposed to make presence fade until memory replaces reality. But with you, distance behaved differently. It sharpened things. Instead of forgetting your perspective, I started noticing it inside my own thoughts. Instead of missing conversations, I found myself continuing them internally, not intentionally, not romantically, not even consciously. It simply happened, as naturally as breathing. And that unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. Because I've always trusted my independence. My inner world has always belonged entirely to me. It's the one place no one has ever occupied without invitation. Every thought, every conclusion, every realization, they were mine, untouched, self-contained. Until one day I caught myself reaching a conclusion and wondering how you would see it before I even finished thinking. I stopped immediately, not because the thought frightened me, because it confused me. When had another perspective become woven so naturally into my own that separating them required, had that become normal? When had another perspective become woven so naturally into my own that separating them required conscious effort? I couldn't answer. The answer didn't exist. Or maybe it existed somewhere too subtle to remember. That's when I understood something I'd been resisting for a long time. Some connections don't arrive through time. They arrive through recognition. Recognition is strange. It ignores chronology. It doesn't care whether you've known someone for years or weeks. It doesn't ask permission from logic. It simply recognizes structure. something familiar beneath everything unfamiliar. As if two minds discover they have been solving different questions using the same language all along. That realization stayed with me, not because it demanded attention, because it refused to disappear. Every attempt to dismiss it only made it return with greater clarity. I've always believed understanding someone required accumulation, shared memories, long conversations, conflict, forgiveness, history. History was supposed to build closeness, yet somehow our understanding arrived before history had the chance. That shouldn't happen. At least it shouldn't happen often enough to trust, which is why I questioned myself instead. Maybe I was seeing patterns I was projecting. Maybe I was seeing patterns that weren't there. Maybe I wanted meaning badly enough that my mind created it, so I became more careful, more observant. I watched every interaction with almost clinical attention, every pause, every sentence, every silence, waiting for inconsistency, waiting for the illusion to break. It never did. Instead, the consistency became impossible to ignore. You never responded to who you expected me to be. You responded to who I actually was. There's a difference, a significant one. Most people hear enough to prepare their own reply. Very few hear enough to understand what remains unsaid. You always seemed interested in what existed underneath the sentence rather than inside it, as though language itself wasn't the destination, only the bridge. I noticed it over and over again. Whenever I hid uncertainty behind certainty, you answered the uncertainty. Whenever I disguised exhaustion as composure, you somehow addressed the exhaustion without exposing it. Whenever I left thoughts unfinished, you never rushed to complete them. You simply allowed them to exist. There's a rare kind of respect in that, the respect of not forcing clarity before someone is ready to give it. I didn't realize how uncommon that was until I experienced it consistently. People often mistake patience for silence. They're different. Silence can be empty. Patience contains understanding. Your silence always felt intentional, never absent, never disconnected, just present, steady, like someone who trusted meaning to arrive naturally rather than demanding immediate explanation. The strange part is that trust slowly changed me, without instruction, without discussion, without either of us acknowledging it directly. I became less interested in protecting every thought, less concerned with appearing perfectly understood, because somewhere along the way, being understood stopped feeling like something I had to earn. It simply existed. That realization altered something fundamental inside me, not dramatically, quietly, like a compass adjusting 1 degree at a time until, months later, you realize you've been walking toward an entirely different horizon. I don't know whether you've noticed any of this. Maybe you have. Maybe you haven't. Oddly enough, that isn't the important part anymore. The important part is recognizing what has already happened inside me, because awareness eventually reaches a point where observation is no longer enough. Eventually, you have to admit the truth. You've been carefully examining from every possible angle, and my truth is painfully simple. Life feels different after someone changes the way you experience your own mind, not because they replace it, because they expand it. Once expansion happens, returning to smaller spaces becomes impossible. You can pretend, you can distract yourself, you can convince yourself nothing has changed, but the structure remains altered. The ceiling is higher now, the room is larger, your perception has already adapted, and every attempt to shrink back feels artificial. That's where I find myself now, standing somewhere between certainty and consequence, certain of what has changed, uncertain only about what comes next, because understanding something isn't the same as deciding what to do with it. Understanding asks for honesty, decisions ask for courage, and perhaps that's the part I've been delaying all along. I used to believe that certainty arrived all at once, like a switch. One moment you questioned everything, and the next moment every answer stood perfectly in front of you. Life has taught me otherwise. The things that matter the most never arrive complete. They reveal themselves slowly, not because they're hiding, but because we're changing at the exact speed required to recognize them. Maybe that's why I never noticed the exact moment you became part of my perspective. There wasn't one conversation that changed everything. No single sentence. No unforgettable moment. If someone asked me when it happened, I wouldn't know what to tell them, because nothing happened. And somehow, everything did. I think about that more often than I'd like to admit, not with confusion, with curiosity. How can something become so deeply rooted without announcing itself? How can another person's presence settle so naturally inside your thoughts that eventually you stop noticing the difference between what has always been there and what quietly became part of you? I've searched for an explanation countless times. Every explanation feels incomplete. People talk about chemistry, about compatibility, about timing, about emotional connection. Maybe those things exist. Maybe they matter. But none of them describe this, because what I experienced wasn't an increase in feeling, it was an increase in clarity. That's the only word that continues to feel accurate. Clarity. The kind that removes noise instead of adding excitement. The kind that doesn't make life louder. It makes everything easier to hear. Before you, I spent an unreasonable amount of energy translating myself, adjusting my words, rearranging thoughts, predicting misunderstandings before they happened, not because people intended to misunderstand me, because we all interpret the world through different patterns. No one sees reality exactly the same way. I've accepted that for years. It's one of the reasons I learned to keep certain parts of myself internal. Some thoughts lose their meaning the moment they're simplified. Some experiences become smaller the moment they're explained carelessly. So I stopped explaining, not out of frustration, out of preservation. Certain things deserve to remain untouched rather than poorly understood. Then you arrived, and something unexpected happened. I noticed I wasn't translating anymore. Not because I suddenly became more expressive, because expression no longer felt like work. The distance between what I meant and what you understood became strangely small, smaller than I thought possible. That difference changed everything. Without realizing it, I stopped preparing for misunderstanding. I stopped rehearsing conversations in my mind before having them. I stopped wondering whether I was being interpreted correctly. I simply existed. For someone like me, that isn't a small adjustment. It's an entirely different way of living. Freedom doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes freedom is simply the absence of unnecessary effort. That's what your presence became. The absence of effort I didn't realize I had been carrying for years. It's strange what disappears once you no longer need it. Defensiveness, overthinking, the constant habit of explaining yourself before anyone even asks. Those things faded so gradually that I almost missed them leaving. Only afterward did I recognize the silence they left behind, a quieter mind, a steadier pace, an unexpected sense of rest. Not because life became easier, because understanding stopped feeling conditional. That realization forced me to confront another truth. I'd always believed that closeness required constant maintenance, frequent conversations, shared routines, regular reassurance, continuous proof. Now I'm not so certain, because somehow, even in moments we weren't speaking, nothing felt interrupted. The connection didn't disappear between conversations. It remained invisible, unmoving, like a current beneath the surface of still water. Most relationships rely on interaction. This seemed to rely on recognition. Recognition doesn't panic when silence appears. It doesn't assume absence means distance. It trusts what already exists. I've never experienced that before. not with this level of consistency, which made me question another assumption I'd carried for most of my life. Maybe true understanding isn't built through endless communication. Maybe communication simply reveals an understanding that was already possible. That thought stayed with me for days, then weeks. Eventually, I stopped arguing with it. Not because I proved it, because I kept living it. I began noticing subtle changes in myself, the kind no one else would ever recognize. I became slower before judging people. Not because my standards changed, because your way of observing quietly influenced my own. You never seemed interested in reaching conclusions quickly. You allowed people space to become fully visible before deciding who they were. I admired that long before I realized I was learning from it. That's another thing I didn't expect. Influence without instruction, growth without intention, no attempt to shape each advice, no lessons, no attempt to shape each other, only presence. Yet somehow, presence accomplished what words rarely could. It refined me, not into someone different, into someone closer to who I already was. Beneath unnecessary habits, there's a difference between changing someone and uncovering them. I've been thinking about that difference a lot. The world often celebrates transformation, becoming someone new, reinventing yourself, leaving your old identity behind. But I don't think that's what happened here. You didn't introduce me to a different version of myself. You quietly removed the distance between me and the version that had been waiting underneath all along. That's why nothing about this feels artificial. Artificial things require maintenance. This doesn't. It simply continues, like gravity, like seasons, like truth. Whether I acknowledge it or not, it remains. Some nights, I wonder whether you've experienced anything similar, whether this quiet recognition exists on both sides, whether you've noticed these invisible shifts, or whether they've happened so naturally that they've become impossible to separate from daily life. Then I stop myself, because strangely, I no longer need the answer as much as I once thought I did. Not because the answer doesn't matter, because what I've already experienced is enough to know my own reality. Validation from another person can confirm an experience. It can't create one. What happened inside me already exists. Independent of explanation, independent of certainty, independent even of outcome. Maybe that's why I'm no longer afraid of asking difficult questions. Not because I expect comfortable answers, because avoiding the questions no longer protects anything. The truth has already settled. All silence can do now is delay the moment I fully admit it to myself, and perhaps that's the final illusion I've been holding on to. The belief that acknowledgement creates reality. It doesn't. Reality arrives first. Acknowledgement simply catches up. I think mine finally has. Here's an original ending that captures the same emotional direction without continuing or closely reproducing the text you shared. Maybe every question I've been asking has been pointing toward the same answer. Not an answer about you, an answer about me. For so long, I believed that strength meant remaining untouched. That if I could keep every part of myself carefully arranged, carefully protected, carefully understood only by me, then nothing unexpected could ever change the foundation beneath my feet. I see now that I misunderstood what stability really is. Real stability isn't the absence of change. It's knowing that something can change you without taking anything away from who you are. That's the difference. Nothing inside me feels replaced. Nothing feels lost. If anything, everything feels more complete than it did before. Not because you've filled an empty space, because you've shown me that the space was always there, waiting to be recognized. I spent years believing that understanding was something I had to guard. That if someone came too close, they would eventually misunderstand me, reshape me, or reduce me into something easier to explain. Maybe that's happened before. Maybe that's why I became so careful. But life has a strange way of proving our oldest assumptions incomplete. You never asked me to become simpler. You never asked me to become louder. You never asked me to become someone easier to understand. You met me exactly where I was. And somehow, that quiet acceptance accomplished more than any reassurance ever could. It reminded me that being fully seen doesn't always require being fully explained. Some things don't need constant definition. They only need honesty. That's where I am now. Honest, not because every uncertainty has disappeared, because I've stopped pretending uncertainty makes something less real. It doesn't. Sometimes the most meaningful parts of life arrive before certainty does. Sometimes understanding comes first. The explanation follows later, if it follows at all. I've stopped waiting for perfect language. I've stopped believing I need absolute certainty before I acknowledge what already exists. Some truths become obvious long before they become comfortable. This is one of them. Whatever this has become, it has already changed the way I move through my own thoughts. It has changed the way I listen, the way I observe, the way I trust silence instead of fearing it. Those changes aren't temporary. They're part of me now. And strangely, I'm grateful for them. Not because they made life easier, because they made life more honest. There was a time when I thought protecting myself meant closing every door before anyone could reach it. Now I think protection looks different. Sometimes it means allowing the right door to remain open. Not because you're certain about what's waiting on the other side, because you've realized that fear is no longer a good enough reason to keep it closed. I don't know what tomorrow asks of us. I don't know what shape this will take. I don't know which conversations are still waiting to happen, or which silences will eventually say everything words never could. For once, I don't need those answers today. The future will arrive when it's ready. It always does. What matters is that I no longer feel the need to outrun it. For the first time in a long while, I'm willing to stand exactly where I am, without forcing conclusions, without inventing distance, without pretending this has been anything less than what it is, because some moments don't ask for certainty, they ask for presence, and I've finally understood the difference. So if this is where the path changes, I'll make it let it. If this is where understanding becomes choice, I'll make it consciously. Not because I know every outcome, because I know myself well enough to recognize what deserves to be carried forward. Some people pass through your life like seasons. Beautiful, temporary. They leave memories. Others leave lessons. A few leave scars. But every so often, someone arrives whose presence becomes part of the architecture of who you are. Not because they asked for that place, because, over time, you realize the structure feels more complete with them than it ever did without them. That realization isn't loud. It doesn't need to be. Truth rarely does. It simply settles. Quietly, batly. Until one day you stop searching for another explanation and accept the one that's been waiting for you all along. And maybe that's where this story was always leading. Not toward an ending, not toward a perfect definition, but toward a single decision. To stop resisting what has already become part of me. To stop treating clarity like something that needs permission to exist. To stop looking backward in search of the moment everything changed. Because it doesn't matter when it happened anymore. What matters is that it did. And now, instead of asking whether I can return to the person I was before all of this, I find myself asking a different question. Why would I want to? Some journeys aren't meant to bring you back to where you started. They're meant to introduce you to the version of yourself that was waiting beyond everything you thought you understood. If that's where this path leads, then I'll keep walking. Not with certainty, not without fear, but with the quiet confidence that comes from finally recognizing a truth I've carried for far longer than I realized. And this time, I won't turn away from it.